Thanks everybody for tuning into this episode. Today we have Beth Napleton, who's the executive leadership coach and consultant. Beth, thank you so much for your time on this hot day in Chicago.
I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Per usual, we like to start our episodes by asking a little bit about the guest. So share a little bit about yourself and your organization.
Absolutely. So I somehow have been working in mission-driven organizations for over 25 years. When I started my career as a classroom teacher and found that to be really fulfilling and really great work. And what I found is after working, I think in the first 7 years of my career, I worked for 5 different principals, and I saw so many of my colleagues leave the profession because they were frustrated by, I think, what I would now call basic management challenges, right? But at the time, I felt
Mm,
like, what is happening with the leadership education? And I want to stay in this, and I want to stay in this work, and it's so important. And so after that experience, I think about 8 years in, I decided to learn a little bit more about managing so that I could stay in mission driven work for the long haul. And so I went to go work for a large nonprofit. I led a summer school program that trained 600 teachers. We kind of village every year. I really wanted to learn a lot of the tools that get put in my toolkit, which I later then used to go back into education and started a small charter school working in the far south side of Chicago. And so I felt like I could use those skills and talents, use the instructional expertise I had gained, and put it together to start a school. And we opened with fourth and fifth grades in 2013. And in 2021, graduated our first class of seniors, 100% of whom were admitted to at least 2 4-year colleges, universities, with most of them being first generation students. And so that was kind of where I was at till about 2 years ago. And I think a number of factors led me to reflect. I grew this school. I'm always like a growing and starting person. So I'm always starting things and
yeah.
starting programs. And I was like, I knew that once that we kind of finished growing the school, that it would be a short time. I was like, maybe I should take a few years as victory laps and just really enjoy this and enjoy having alumni and think about that next stage of the organization. And then the pandemic hit and I was like, oh, I think it's going to need some leadership with some fresh energy to lead it out of this situation. And so I decided to go out on my own and become a leadership coaching consultant. And so now I work with leaders in mission driven organizations with some of those management challenges, sometimes basic, sometimes complicated, but kind of the things that are when leaders sit at their desk and think about how are we going to get to our vision and our mission, there are usually some challenges that immediately come to mind. And often they involve people because we need people to reach our goal of the mission, and people are super complex, right? And have lots of like feelings and skills and baggage and need training and all of those different pieces. And so how do you help as a leader to get to that point of where you're reaching your mission and vision and working through the kind of team, any sort of the people challenges that may come in?
Yeah. Yeah. You said mission driven a bunch of times so far.
Mhm.
How do you define mission driven?
Yeah. It's about when there is a kind of purpose, greater than like the big picture. And so I don't work exclusively in education, but I work a lot with
Right.
schools and districts, right? Given my background. And, you can have two schools that are virtually identical in terms of enrollment and location and grades served. But there is a difference when a school is on a mission, right? We want to really inspire learners. We want to prepare the next generation of scientists, right? To do this. And you can really tell when you're kind of just like checking a box and going through a list of like, well, we had school, we fulfill their government obligations, to provide children with an education, and the sense of like, hey, there's like something bigger that we want to accomplish here. It's often more complicated, it's often more difficult, but it goes beyond any set of annual goals. It goes beyond any one person. And it's about kind of usually like making a bigger mark and leading, kind of moving the arc of the universe more towards justice.
Right. Right. What are some of the management challenges? So, like, and this is where ChatGPT can't answer questions, right? It's like from your experience, you're deep in it. Like, what have you seen from your experience? Are some of the main management challenges? And maybe we could talk specifically to the education industry if that's your own focus. But feel free to take it where you want. But maybe some common reoccurring challenges that you're seeing
Yeah,
being faced.
absolutely. I mean, I think in some ways it's like really true. I work with a variety of clients, and I think that, there's always nuance specific to where they live or how long they've been in this role or what their kind of work is. But I think that, and in a lot of ways, I think it's like the challenge of leading adults, right? Like, and that would be true if you were trying to have everyone in a rowboat moving in the same direction down the Chicago River, or if you were trying to get them to, make sure that kids can get into college. And so I think that a lot of times it's about how do you get a group of people invested in goals, right? And goals can be tricky because, it's like that Goldilocks. You don't want them to be too much or too soft or too hard. They're kind of right in that middle. And how do you do that for a group of people? There are often challenges. And I think this is particularly true in the last few years with role clarity. Are people clear on their roles and what they do versus what someone else do? When do I, when do I bring my executive director in? When do I not? And executive directors feel this all the time because if somebody's coming to them with every little thing, they're like, oh my gosh, what do I do? And then they have also people
Right.
who never help them. And that's a different kind of problem. And so I think that there's a lot around, I think there's a lot of issues around teams and how they function. It is, it's almost like I've been, watching the NBA conference finals, right, leading up to the championship starting this week. And, when you watch a team that you're like, they make this look so easy, right? Like, this is how you score, 120 points. And it's like, it's actually super, super complicated to get a team functioning, right, with all the skills and all those elements in the right way. And I think that's true of a team at work, too. There's a million ways that can go
Mm,
wrong. Interpersonal conflict, people feeling stretched personally from where they are at home. I think oftentimes in startups or in growing organizations, right, the roles shift. And so that can be, we had role clarity last year, but now we don't, or we're in this ambiguous. And so, there's a lot that I work with people around that kind of starts off with like a general culture challenge. And one of the things I do is I work with
right.
people like getting under the hood and start to think about like, why is this? Is because there's not role clarity because as a leader, you're asking people to do one thing, but you're actually doing another. And so you need to be
Mm,
conscious that there might be some hypocrisy. Is it because people don't believe you can achieve these goals. So they're not kind of willing to like go to the mattresses for them. And so I'll really work with leaders either in a coaching relationship or sometimes in a consulting relationship or in what I call a coach salty relationship, which I think takes the best of both worlds and say, let's kind of get under it and see what's going on. You've had a ton of turnover in the last 2 years and you want this to stop. You're really frustrated with how you're working with your board. Great. Let's get into that. And so they usually come to me when they're like, I'm trying to think I can think of and I just need someone with, I don't have the time to do this and I don't have the outside person. And so how do they bring me in as kind of an extension
right.
of themselves and let me work with help them. So I think that in a lot of ways, it's the same stuff, just in a different, it looks a little different if it's in a preschool or if it's in, at a Big Ten university, right? Both of whom I've worked with, but it's the same stuff, right? And people aren't, it's challenges of being human, honestly. Come to work, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And is a lot of the consulting that you're doing, does it typically have to be top down since you're working with usually the leaders at these organizations? Or do
I
they
think
want you to typically engage with their directs or their broader organization or school?
that's a great question. I think often one of the reasons leaders bring me in is because they need one to be some eyes and ears, and they need someone who has no skin in the game, and people will just be more candid with me. And so, with anyone, because it's just hard. If I see that the boss is burning the midnight oil, and I see them I'm gonna feel bad saying, "Well, I actually don't feel like I'm compensated appropriately," right? When I know they've been working with
Yeah,
me.
yeah.
So, I think when you bring in a consultant there, part of what I can do is convene focus groups and do surveys and do data analysis and do interviews. And I think that's part of people will have a level of candor because I can say I always say it's anonymous, but not confidential. So I might use the quote that you say, but I'm not going to say it's Joseph, right? But I'm going to say, well, based on
Right,
what this
right.
pattern is and where we're hearing. And I think there's an element where, sometimes like when leaders are reading reports or surveys, like a comment can like stick to them and they'll kind of fixate on it because that's a very human reaction when you're working personally on something. So when you bring in a consultant, you're able to say, yeah, I know you're thinking about that, right? Like, I get it. You're human. Like, let's process and feel those feelings. And that was one comment. There's actually like 15 that talk about this other thing. And so let's talk about this other thing because that is actually what's going to help move the needle the most when we think about how to get closer to what can sometimes seem like an elusive vision.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So my wife is also parallel works with in the education industry, and she'd mentioned something recently, and I haven't looked too much into it myself, but there's like a great resignation or something like the great
Mm,
resignation is happening in the education industry. I don't know if it was recent or currently happening. And from my perspective, I work in the tech industry, and one of the reasons I chose this industry is because if you look at, I mean, like the medium pay in different industries, typically the education industry is lower, right? And I think that's I'm assuming one of the challenges that is being faced industry wide. Have you had that discussion with some of the leaders that you're working with, and how do you address that?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that's a great question. I mean, so a couple of things is that one, I think that the talent landscape in education has always been hard. It's always been hard, especially to find schools that are often under resourced need teachers the most. How do you find teachers who are qualified to teach special education or high school science, right? So like it's never been easy. And then the pandemic just like blew it up, right? Because all of a sudden it was, I think like
Yeah.
everyone was forced into work conditions that, nobody signed up to teach school remotely. And so it felt very different to be a teacher behind a camera, and many
Yeah.
districts were remote for years. And yet on the flip side, when it was time to go back to work, then people were like, I kind of like being able to do my laundry on my lunch
Yeah.
break, right? And so there's a
Yep.
level of
Yeah.
flexibility that I think that every industry is grappling with right now. Do we return to work? Do we return to work 5 days? What do we do? How do I navigate this? But the challenges in schools, look, like the kids are there. Like you can't just like do remote Fridays. Like that's actually not good for kids. It's not good for consistency. It's not good for them developmentally. And so I think leaders right now are struggling because to some extent, this has always been a case. How do we be more flexible? How do we make sure we structure jobs in this way? But I think they just feel like I have a lot less tools at my disposal than people might who can
Mm.
say, hey, why don't we do, remote Mondays or whatever, or do a hybrid.
Yeah.
And so I think that, that is certainly happening. I think it is. We're still seeing kind of some of the ripple effects of that. And certainly I think, often people have struggled with compensation, right? And benefits and how do you do this? And so I think what it is often working with leaders and, sitting down, like, you always have a finite number of dollars. That's just the reality of any organization, right? And so and sometimes executive directors or superintendents have their hands tied because there's certain pay scales or contracts or whatever, they're limited.
Right.
But actually, when we think about, and the research shows us that when people think about like where they want to work, it's not just the pay, right? It's about the colleagues. It's about if
Right.
you're
Right.
growing. It's about if people care about you. It's about if you feel like you're making a difference every day. And so I think sometimes what I can do is help leaders kind of pull up and say, hey, like your school is doing great work. Your nonprofit is doing awesome work. How are we really highlighting that? How are people feeling that every day? How are we acknowledging this work can really be draining and difficult? And it's also so important. And how do we kind of create some internal cycles that help people reflect and realize? How do we highlight these elements? And so it's certainly always been it's something that comes up. I think I'm trying to think if there's like an issue that because people are
Yeah.
anything you want to get done, they're always a part of this conversation. You know what I mean? Even if you're not in the middle of this,
Right.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, it sounds like the coaching for leaders that are experiencing that is like the number one is like making sure that you're transparent about the process and like for example, if I was an executive director and somebody was coming up to me and saying, I want more pay. Like you said,
Mhm.
you could only control so much in that position based on budget. So the first probably step is talking about that process and that you're controlling as much as you can as an executive director, but also trying to loop back into the vision and if that vision has been established yet of what you're trying to do organizationally, and then having discussions as well about other reasons why people stick in that industry, in
Yeah.
that job.
Well, people,
So
and
yeah.
often say too, you also just have to talk like, I work a lot when I'm coaching leaders. We work often on just how do you, it's like people sometimes like give you like little nibbles and how do you kind of like keep pulling that thread to get more. So, and, people come and say, like, I just want more flexibility. I don't feel like I can work here unless it's more flexible. There can be knee jerk reaction from leaders. Well, we've done all this stuff. So I guess that's it. As opposed to like, can you actually just
Mm,
sit down and I'll role play this with people like, coach, like, what do you mean by flexibility? Like, literally
exactly.
walk
Yeah.
me through like what a flexible Tuesday looks like. What does that mean for your planning? What does that mean for what you're wearing? What does that mean for your ability to come and go? And often what leaders discover, and I really work with them on like, your job in that conversation is just to listen. You can take notes
Yep.
and that's like, and basically like be like, so I hear you saying that and repeat it. Don't answer, don't rebut, just listen. And then let's come back together and talk about what this could because I more often than not, there's something in there, right? And when people say like, I just want to be able to go off campus to get my lunch, you're like, this is highly doable. Do you know what I mean? Or
Yep.
actually, oh, this to me, you think this is highly doable, but let me also, as a leader, be transparent about why this isn't right. Because given
Right.
how street construction works nearby, the chances of getting back on time. But what if we had a thing where once a week we had, pitched in and got lunch delivered and, I'll absorb some of the costs. Like you can think about these things, but you have to really like listen to what people are saying and really ask and think about it. And I think leaders sometimes, because they're busy, because they have a lot going on, can like skip over that stuff, right? And it's actually
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. We're going to be jumping around a bit, but I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into those topics before the next topic. And it's kind of like going backwards. But you personally, why is this an industry, and why is working with mission driven leaders so important to you? And like, at what point in your life were you like, this is something that I want to be focused on? These are the type of impacts I want to have. I'd love to hear your background into that realization.
Oh, yeah. It's so interesting. I remember when I was 14, I was like, okay, I am going to have a career. And let's see if I can remember them. Three things are going to be true. One, I want it to be something that like takes advantage of my talents, right? And so, I
Right.
want to feel like I'm putting my talents to work. Two, I'm going to try and make the world a better place in some way. And three, I want to learn. And so those, it's
Mm,
interesting because even through all the like shifts in my career, I've kind of gone back to that. And that has always been a touchstone. And so I think when it became clear that it was time for me, it was probably about 2018. And the school had about 3 more years to being fully grown. But I had gone through a divorce. And so all of a sudden I was now the primary caretaker at home. I had additional responsibilities in terms of breadwinning. And I'm looking at the school. It's starting to finish up this, what's been a tremendous growth trajectory. I started to think about like, what do I want to do next? And I thought about going corporate. I thought about foundation work. And what I really realized is that in my own journey as a leader, there were a couple of times I could point to where I had a coach or a consultant come in who really helped me get people. I always think about leadership as the never ending staircase, and you're just kind of trying to get to the next step.
mhm.
And sometimes you're kind of like stuck and you just like can't break through. And I would have people who came in and kind of like essentially help give me a boost and help me get to that next level, which then allowed me to kind of continue on the staircase. And I realized that, I had a lot of mixed feelings about leaving the nonprofit space because that's where I had been working for so many years. And I felt like, how can I do this? And my role be important. It felt like, oh, well, if I am doing this in a way that it's helping other leaders, just like those people came in and helped me level up, and I can go help other leaders climb up a level, I am going to feel, I think that's a good place to go to kind of meet these personal needs I have to have more flexible work and more lucrative work. And then I also can still continue to make a difference in a place that I really care about and can bring these skill sets to bear.
Yeah. And is that like a similar experience, or like when you're talking with your clients, the people that you're
Mhm.
working with, the mission driven leaders, what are there any commonalities in their backstory of wanting to be continually engaged in mission driven work? Or is that something you help them realize or verbalize?
That it depends, oftentimes I think oftentimes there is a real question of often when I'm working with people, the question they're asking is, how can I continue doing this work? So I work a lot with people who are younger parents, women who are, going on maternity leave and then coming back into, this position, people who are growing their families. And, it just is different. Like here I am, I have a client I'm thinking of who really was just an incredibly hard worker and used to put in like 15-hour days. And I've been working with
Yeah.
her. She's about to have her second kid in the fall. And I worked with her before she went on maternity leave for her first. And when I started working with her, she thought, I can't go on, I have to take really short leave. I can't my school. They depend on me. I helped turn it around. She was like very an alternative school that has a really interesting model that to them. How am I going to do this? And I kind of helped work with her. I did this coach consulting. So I would do some of the work. I helped draft a maternity plan, draft communications, did some of the work a consultant would do. And then I was coaching her through implementing. Right now, have this conversation.
Mm,
How did that go? Let's debrief. Oh, that he's something different than we thought. So now let's adjust our approach here. And we were able to ensure she went on leave for 12 weeks. She didn't take a work phone call. She was able to spend time with her baby. And she came back and felt like this is really doable. And she came back and felt like, great, now I can. And by the way, now that I'm reentering after having been a little bit less hands-on, obviously 12 weeks, now how do I go back in deliberately to kind of stay involved at the level that I want to? And now here she is, right, looking with kid number two coming, and it's like, okay, well, what
yeah.
does this mean? How do we continue to work on this? How do we think about what this means? Because now you can't go home and go to sleep at 6 o'clock because you're tired, because you have a toddler at home who wants to spend time with you. And so how do you, What does this mean for you? And how do I continue in this work? And so I think that that often is, whether people got into it because of their own experiences, the teacher that made a
Yeah.
difference in their life or a time in their life when they were unhoused. And so they want to come back and help people who, struggle with some of the basic needs. Like people often have a reason they got into it, but by the time I work with them, it's often like, well, this is kind of what I do. I've been doing it for 10, 15 years, 20 years. And now but I'm like at an impasse and how do I kind of, because as I've evolved, I'm wondering if I can continue to throw, this client of mine used to, work these 15 hours. She can't work 15-hour days anymore. She's exhausted. Right. And so like,
Yeah.
how do you do that? And how does she do that in a way that where she feels good about what she's contributing, even though the way in which she's doing it looks very different than how she might have approached it 3 or 4 years ago.
Right. Right. So when you're working with these leaders in their schools, whatever age
Yeah.
they serve, what are some characteristics of like the idealistic organization, maybe operationally and people wise? Is it like open communication or clear goals? I'd love to hear just the characteristics that you
Wow.
notice of like once we get to an awesome operating state where we've reached some of these
What
goals
does it
and
look
stuff.
like?
Like exactly.
Yeah, I think a few things. I mean, one, I think that everybody in that organization from the, hourly employee to the, new student who started yesterday can say, here's what we're doing here, right? Here's what we're about. And it's usually not an exhaustive list. So I do think that's one of
Yeah.
the great challenges of leadership is taking these really complex ideas with many tentacles. How do you get it down to this is what we focus, right? And everyone knows this, everyone's got it, and everyone's kind of saying, and I tell leaders, like, it's counterintuitive because you're like, I have to change out what I say and do this. But it's like, actually, you want your team to be able, they'll complete your sentences for you because they know what you're going to say. It's so predictable. You're leading them there. You're inspiring. They kind of build each other up. I think people are generally caring, but they also will challenge people directly, hold each other accountable, kind of, in the best ways of any team. You've usually got some amount of transparency for sure. I think this is an area leaders often struggle with, like, oh, I can't talk anything about compensation. Well, yes, you can, right? I can't talk anything about this potential legal issue. Well, there's a way to say this. So, that's one of this work with leaders on to kind of help them do that. What I think there's you know, I would say too, like people are generally enjoying, right? And not every day at every moment, but I think there is a sense of like we're in it for something bigger than ourselves and we're on a mission and we're doing good work. And at various points people are tired or they need a break or need to rest. But I do think that people feel like this is meaningful, important work and I'm glad I get to do it. And I think that that can be challenging, even as like a societal message to go, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Is there like as a leader, is should you work to create an environment where your employees would feel open to sharing if they don't understand or if they're not aligned with the vision or if they want to have input on maybe the vision development? Or is that something that usually you have to work with top down? I'd love to hear about like the culture. You mentioned in the beginning, like you always usually start with the culture aspect.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I think one thing I often think about when I'm starting to work with a client, and there's a state, usually one of the things I coach salting is we do this like current analysis, right? Where we're like pull together a ton of data and sometimes that's compiling the survey that people will have them. We talk to funders, we do focus groups, we do interviews. But kind of a cross section of people about kind of essentially glows and grows, right? And what are you noticing and what are you worried about? And one thing I'm always thinking about is are people telling the leader what they are telling me? Right? Is this going to come back and be full of surprises? Because if it is, and we have a separate problem to take care of first, which is that we need to make sure that people
Right.
feel comfortable. What I used to, and I think this is a human piece is we sometimes called it my school. You have to be able to disagree at the table, but agree in the hallway. Right. And what we see in a lot of schools is it's flipped at the table. Oh, great idea. Yep. We love it. And then it's when you walk out of the meeting, right? Or, well, this will never work. Here's why. And so if you're a leader who has a culture right now that has that kind of, so when I talk to leaders who have that, hey, look, people are saying things they say it's a good idea, but then they sabotage it or they backtalk me or they get back to the grapevine. I don't know what to do. I'll work with them for like a 3 to 6 month engagement and we'll say, here's where the culture is now and here's where we want to get it to and what do we have to do. And it's a very individual path for each organization. size, where they're at, what they're going through, right? It's going to depend on a lot of factors, but we need to kind of, you're going, northeast and we need to go southwest. So how do we kind of like map that plan and start to get you guys in that direction? Because right now it's positive based and
Yeah.
people aren't doing their best work. They're not doing it. So, I think it's like there's a lot of pieces, sometimes I work with, I've been the Girl Scouts as a client. I mean, they're like 100 years old, right? And so, like, I don't know that they're going to kind of be part of co-creating that vision. But if you're at a school that started, if you're running a small nonprofit, right, there might be opportunities like new initiatives or what does this look like? Or given, role of technology in our organization changes, what can we do to come in? So,
Yeah. Yeah. Oh. One other note that I wrote down here is I feel so maybe it's I don't think it's industry specific, but I feel like as we are progressing through our career, a lot of what we're told is like figure out how to be indispensable in your role. And I don't know if that was like a response of like a fear of losing your job.
mm,
So try to be indispensable so you can't get fired or whatnot. But I'm wondering at what point does that change? Because I feel like in a leadership perspective, if you're indispensable and if an organization can't run without you, that's
mm,
not putting your organization in a good spot, right? So I'm wondering if like once you become the leader of an organization, is that when it shifts? Or should you never really think about how you want to become indispensable because that's not what's best for the organization if you don't pass the hit by a bus test.
right.
So yeah.
Yeah, no, it's so true. And I think like in some ways when I think about that advice, I think about when people are kind of younger in their careers, right? I think that's in some ways
Yep.
about like
Same.
figuring out like, there are the responsibilities on paper and hopefully
Hmm.
everyone has them or like, the major bullets. And it's a little bit about like, how do you kind of fill in the gaps and fill in those pieces? How do you learn
Yeah.
to it might not say, play devil's advocate for an idea that might not be the right fit on your sheet, but you are able to start doing that. And people then really respect you for that because you're willing to say what you think. And so it's almost like, I don't know, when you make a gingerbread house, like you put the walls up and you have to kind of like put some frosting in different places to get it to stick together. I feel like this is like,
Yep.
how do you kind of put that frosting in so that like your bulleted job descriptions fit together? But I think you're right as a leader, I think, and I work with a lot of, I have to be there. I'm not there every day. Things fall apart. And, it's a dangerous place to be in for an organization and
Yeah.
for a leader personally. It starts to feel like I can't take a vacation because,
Mhm.
what would they do without me? It starts to feel like organizationally, I can't leave. Well, my partner's looking at, grad school across the country, but I don't know. I couldn't leave my job and that doesn't feel great. And so I think that is sometimes where I'll kind of come in and work with leaders. How do you figure this out? And there's, you can be doing really important work that's very helpful to the organization and it can function smoothly in your absence, right? And so
Yep.
how do we make both these things true? Because I think people worry, well, if it can function in my absence, then I'm obviously not contributing a lot. It's like, well, that's not true. It just can continue to run,
Right.
right?
Right.
And so how do you as a leader, and often when you are moving up through the ranks and maybe you're going from being an individual contributor and then you're starting to have some individual contributions and managing others, and then you're managing others. And then really often the leaders I work with are managing managers. And so it kind of takes a different shift to think about how do I strategically make an
Right.
impact when maybe I'm not as essential to the day to day as I used to be. And so, I think that it can be for the good of everyone. You want to make sure that,
Yeah.
and that goes for any position, right? I mean, if you depend on one person or one role to be there, it is like, and look, at a startup or in the early years, you shouldn't feel like, oh, but I'm starting an organization and what are they going to do? Because, you know, it's like, well, you're starting up. This is a phase, right? And that's okay. But how do you get to that point where it doesn't need you? Or at least the
Yeah.
things that it doesn't need you for different things as you kind of evolve.
Awesome. All right. Well, I think time flies. Like I mentioned before you started rolling. So for Beth Napleton Consulting, what type of engagement do you look for and how can people find you?
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing for any of your leaders listening out there, I just very exciting have launched a quiz. So it's leadership dash quiz. I hope I'm getting it right. And that is a quiz like a 2-minute quiz, not even to help you figure out what you need most as a leader. And so I would encourage leaders listening to take that. I think that can be clariful. It's like one of those little online quizzes and comes with some resources that help you figure out kind of like what's your biggest challenge right now. So I think that's one resource. And then I also work with coaching clients. I work with consulting. And so I do a bunch of free master classes. I'm like thinking about doing some workshops later. And so I think the quiz actually redirects you to my website to take it. And then you can look
Yeah.
at the website and check it out, sign up for my list and see what's going on. But I think if folks are listening and gosh, I could use this perspective. There's a link to book an intro call. Always like, hey, book a call with me on your drive to or from work. And I'm happy with you about what challenges you're
Yeah.
facing, how I could potentially help. Because I think it is a really challenge. It often can be so isolating and so lonely. And I think part of my role is to help leaders see that like you're not alone and lots of people have been where you are. And these problems are surmountable. You can do this.
Awesome. Well, Beth, thank you so much for your time. I love the conversation and the focus on the education industry. And we have a lot of listeners that are executive directors of nonprofits as well. So I'm sure everyone appreciates your time and your experience. And folks that are listening and interested, get engaged. And we'll be sure to tag you and share your information after this so folks could follow up.
Awesome. Great. Well, it was so fun to be here. I really appreciate being a guest. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for tuning into this episode. If you know of a great organization or individual leaving a positive impact, we'd love to tell their story. Check us out and contact us at gtzp.org. Don't forget, for more stories like this, you could also follow us on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. Instagram followers are link trees in the bio. And for podcast listeners, we're on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Thanks for listening and see you again soon.